I was a big fan of the Nintendo Entertainment System during the mid to late 80s. For about 3 years there, I tried to play every game I could get my hands on. Those classics helped define who I was as a console gamer. But as much as I had enjoyed that time, the Sega Genesis would supplant the NES as my favorite system in 1990. I held on to Nintendo's 8-bit powerhouse for a few more years, but when the Super Nintendo launched in 1991, that was pretty much it. With two 16-bit consoles to support, the NES finally fell to the wayside and I rarely touched it again. The thing is that it kept going for a few more years. It wasn't until 1994 when the NES spat out its last retail release, an impressive 9-year run in the US alone. Because my attention was focused elsewhere in those final years, I missed a lot of games, and in this episode, we are gonna take a look at the final year of releases on the old Nintendo. A number of these I have never played before, so this is as much for me as it is for you. We have some good ones to go over, so let's get started. In January of 1994, the NES received Bonk's Adventure, a port of the PC Engine and TurboGrafx original. It was developed by AI Company Limited, and they did what amounts to an unbelievable job capturing the look and feel of Bonk's first outing. You get the expected cutbacks in color and sprite size, but most of the stages, bosses, and music are really well done. Perhaps the most impressive part of this port is that it was done on a tiny 3 megabit cartridge, which was even smaller than the original released 4 years prior. I was always amazed at what could be pulled out of the NES given the hardware's age and limitations. This was a great way for those that missed Bonk's Adventure to take a look and see what all the fuss was about. Capcom had a great run on the NES with Disney properties, and in January of 1994 they released a sequel to the much beloved Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers. By this point, Capcom had established a style of 8-bit gameplay that could be felt through every one of their releases. It consisted of side-scrolling platforming and hitting enemies with items. In Rescue Rangers 2, that happens to be mainly crates you can pick up and toss. There's a fair amount of vertical scrolling to the stage design, and the music had that comfortable NES flow to it. Visually, it lacks any outstanding effects, but it does have solid detail in the backdrops, and the sprites stay true to the source material. This was not a bad game at all, but I have to admit that by 1994, you had seen so many in this mold that it started to wear a bit thin. It does feature 2-player co-op that is really well done, right down to being able to throw your partner in a team-up attack. It's a tad more linear than the first one, but overall, still a very nice action platformer in the classic Capcom mold. I had thought Alfred Chicken was based on a children's TV show or some obscure movie I had never heard of before. Nope, this was actually a port of an original Game Boy game developed by a company called Twilight and published by Mindscape. It didn't get a US release until February of 1994. Surprisingly, it isn't the stinker I expected. You navigate Alfred Chicken around each stage looking for balloons to free. There's items to collect, hidden passages to explore, and a few power-ups to obtain that give Alfred a little more stopping power. What's here isn't gonna win any awards and it's missing some of the content from the Game Boy original, but for a younger crowd, I think this is more than competent. It's easy to get into, controls well, and the difficulty curve is manageable. The exploration element of finding the balloons and the power-ups make for a pretty solid adventure. There's also versions for the Amiga, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy Color. A spin-off came to the PlayStation in 2002. I remember seeing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters on the NES at Toys R Us when it was released in February of 1994. I just laughed at the thought of just how awful that had to be. The NES did not have many one-on-one fighters in its library, so I can see why the developer thought this might sell well. And you know, outside of some technical shortcomings like loads of sprite flicker, this plays far better than you ever would have guessed. I'd strongly argue it's a better game than the Genesis version. Going back to it is perhaps the biggest problem, however. In the years since, fighting games have really grown and matured, so that 2-button interface here is rudimentary at best. It would be a great starter fighter for younger gamers, especially fans of the IP. As a side note, this would be Konami's final game for the platform. I know this might be shocking, but I was not a big fan of the original Mega Man titles. Those reappearing enemies drove me crazy, and I never felt like the punishing gameplay was good enough to warrant the time investment. In March of 1994, Capcom released Mega Man 6, the last time the Blue Bomber would make an NES appearance. This one gets filed under Enough is Enough with me. Mega Man had a good run during his 8-bit days, but this was 6 games in on the same platform with largely the same design and gameplay still intact. If you've played one of these games, you've pretty much played them all. There's a group of robots that each have a certain attack weapon you can inherit if you defeat them. The thing is that each one is weak to a certain type of weapon, so figuring that out is paramount to your success. Nothing is wrong with Mega Man 6 outside of the ho-hum story about Dr. Wily in disguise, but you have pretty much seen all of this before in some form. It does add some new team-up powers for Mega Man and Rush, but it's nothing groundbreaking or earth-shattering. Of course, if you love the other Mega Man games, you'll likely be a fan of this. I wouldn't jump on this bandwagon until Mega Man X for the Super Nintendo. Now we're getting into the stuff I've never seen or played before the making of this video, with Mickey's Adventures in Numberland leading the pack. This edutainment game was released in March of 1994 by High-Tech Expressions. This looks great with solid animation and detailed stages. The platforming gameplay has you looking for specific numbers in every level, which then gives way to a math problem to complete the area. This was aimed at very young children, and I suppose it would get the job done if you have a youngster just learning their numbers and basic math. Outside of that, there is nothing here for seasoned gamers looking for something a bit more exciting. I had heard of Zoda's Revenge Star Tropics 2, but never played it. It was released in March of 1994, an action-adventure that comes off like a mix of Zelda, Final Fantasy, with a splash of action platforming. You move through different time periods using a top-down perspective to navigate areas and battle enemies. You meet famous people while on the trip to find blocks called tetrads. Being an action-adventure means there are weapons to find, puzzles to deal with, and lots of nooks and crannies to explore. Of all the games in this episode, it's the one I played the longest, and could see myself beating even today. It doesn't have anything on Zelda or the better Nintendo-made games for the platform, but it still has a well-done premise and lots to see and do. I'd love to see Nintendo remake this using a 3D engine for the Switch. The original here was only released in the US, so there is an audience out there that has never experienced it. In June of 1994, the NES received Mario's Time Machine, an edutainment release by the software Toolworks. It was developed by Radical Entertainment in what was one of the few instances Nintendo let the Mario IP be completely handled by an outside entity. The gist of this one is simple. Bowser has been stealing important items from human history and displaying them in his new museum. You and Yoshi go to check it out, only to see Yoshi kidnapped in the process. Mario must go back in time and return the items and rescue poor Yoshi. This uses a side-scrolling design like the other Mario games, but you'll use the platforming mainly to read information blocks so you can learn where to return the items properly. There are some enemies to contend with, but this is set up to be an easy jaunt through history. I can't say it's particularly well done in any one area. The graphics are decent but not incredible. The gameplay, even for the youngsters it's aimed at, isn't something that has any real replay value. The information blocks basically tell you what to do, and the stages are tiny with little else to do. This is well below the quality you expect from a Mario release. There's also a Super Nintendo version that isn't much better. My only experience with the incredible crash dummies in regards to video games is the awful 16-bit Genesis release. When I saw the 8-bit NES edition here on my list, I was dreading playing it. This was dropped in August of 1994 and is an action platformer like so many others for the machine. At first it didn't feel nearly as bad as I had anticipated. The main story has you trying to rescue two other crash dummies. You alternate between two dummies, one with legs and one on a wheel. The gameplay is really fast and you're basically zipping through levels collecting things while avoiding enemies. You do have an air gun that stuns the bad guys up close and an oil gun that takes them out at distance. The stage design is uninspired with loads of drops that cause you to retread ground, and a few levels in, repetition gets pretty bad. It's better than what I had to put up with on the Genesis, but not something I'd ever play again. There's apparently a version of it for the Game Gear, which I might just check out. The Jungle Book games were always competent adventures, and that's about the best I can say for the NES edition here. Released in August of 1994, it features some pretty incredible animation that attempts to sugarcoat the bland, colorless visuals. The middling gameplay gets the job done, but it isn't anything memorable or worth seeking out. Much of what you're doing here is collecting stuff and defeating enemies, but the repetition really hammers your desire to see more. It doesn't really play bad, and I do recommend fans of the 16-bit versions check it out, especially if you appreciate the animated movie. Everyone else can keep moving, however. This is one book you can do without. The final Nintendo Entertainment System game in the US was Wario Woods, a puzzle game developed by TEC and published by Nintendo in December of 1994. The gameplay uses bombs to destroy light-colored monsters in pairs of 3 or more. The twist here is that you move around the bombs and monsters using Toad, who can pick up single items or stacks. As the difficulty rises, you'll get different monsters that need special circumstances met in order to remove them from the play area. It's an interesting concept, but the constant movement required is exhausting. So much is happening, it's difficult to keep up and form any real rhythm. No doubt people that love puzzle games will eat it up, but a casual fan like me plays these types of games sparingly or to relax. Not having direct control over the falling pieces means you are running for your life the entire time, and it grows frustrating quickly. If you are a genre fan, you can likely squeeze a lot out of this one, but casuals may want to stick to easier games like Tetris. I also thought it'd be neat to see the final PAL game released for the NES, The Lion King. This dropped in May of 1995 and is the worst version of the game by a mile. This came out for just about everything, but the visuals and gameplay in the NES edition are well below expectations. It doesn't scroll smoothly, there's massive slowdown in some areas, the gameplay feels awful, and the low-color enemies and backdrops look significantly worse than any other edition. I had a hard time navigating the simplest platforming segment, and it only gets worse the deeper you get in. It tries to mix in some different gameplay styles to sweeten the deal, but they are nothing that makes the rest of it worth slogging through. The Game Gear version was Lion King done well on an 8-bit platform, so I know it was possible. This was a really sad note to end on, and nothing short of a travesty that bears the name of a popular IP. Virgin Interactive should be ashamed of themselves. I wanted to do this video for a few different reasons. As an NES fan, it was interesting to see the last handful of releases for the device, many of which I had never played before. None of these would make a top 10 list to be certain, but I was still surprised so many were decent games. In fact, I enjoyed Zoda's Revenge enough to add the physical cart to my collection. I think as the NES aged, most of its third parties saw it as a younger gamer's machine, which is why it seems like most of these games were aimed at that particular demographic. The NES had been on the North American market for 9 years at this point, and that's something to admire. Even with the Super Nintendo out there, companies still found an audience on this machine. I admit that I loved it myself, and there are countless classics that I consider genre-defining that helped rebuild the US gaming market. I may have been a Sega kid when it came to arcade games in the 80s, but it was Nintendo and their NES that lit my passion for home consoles. For a time there was nothing more exciting than getting a new game for your NES. I got to experience just a tiny bit of that again with this video, and I hope you enjoyed the ride. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.